Hey folks, it's your old pal, King Krampus, and welcome back to Total Party Skills. I thought it might be fun to talk a little bit about genres and how they relate to role-playing games and just some things to keep in mind for both world building or just world presentation when you're running a game for dungeon masters and so on. And since the world's greatest role playing game relies so heavily upon the fantasy genre, I figured I'd make the first video about fantasy. It's not going to be super terribly long. Just some things to get your own brain kind of ticking over. Hopefully, fingers crossed. What exactly is fantasy doing? What does fantasy mean? Fantasy is not quite the same thing as a dream or a memory. Fantasy is something where the person creating the fantasy has an incredible amount of creative control over exactly what it's doing. And the fantasy genre in fiction, for whatever reason, seems to be particularly fixated on fantasizing about the past, a fondly remembered past. Not so much a reflection of how things really were, but how you want to remember them as having been, sort of a thing. I think that's to some degree why some people kind of get riled up if you intrude too much real life historical analogy into their fantasy settings, because the whole notion of fantasy is escapism to a degree that science fiction and horror aren't necessarily about. That's not to say that fantasy means that it's, like some kaleidoscopic painting kind of thing. Like I said, it's not a dream. There is supposed to be a certain fidelity to the fantasy so that the fantasy has some sense of weight. But it is supposed to be an idealized version of the past, at least the way it's most commonly used. And D&D certainly does that. And that's both the source of many of its beloved settings and why it's popular, but that way of a hand-picked, idealized remembrance of a past that never was has also led to some of its problems, and how certain things end up being portrayed, because not necessarily everyone has the same things they want to remember about their past. To be crude about it, if for instance, you had a setting that was explicitly based on a mythologized ancient Africa, would African American gamers really want to see it have a bunch of slavery going on in it, or much like with how so many of the larger mainstream settings for D&D are basically based on a Western European medieval model. They don't necessarily want to have it all be about the Inquisition or racism against ethnic minorities or religious minorities. These worlds are, even with all the horrible monsters and mythical creatures that are out there to fight, the societies are typically more homogenous and don't have the same level of internal conflict beyond maybe some political bickering and thievery going on in the background. But these worlds, you typically don't incorporate the brutal, cruel nature of life back then. I mean, as bad as things might be now, we pale in comparison to how casually cruel and inconsiderate human beings used to be, clannish even, in the older sense, spelled with a C, in attitude towards themselves and others. We live in very watered down times, and it's through those watered down eyes that we create these fantasy worlds that lose all that uncomfortable baggage, from history, and instead, can revel in the childish adventure of the knight slaying the dragon and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, just something to consider. Whether or not you're trying to subvert tropes, you need to know what the baseline is that you want to subvert. If you are trying to use a fantasy setting that's supposed to provoke thought instead of provide a comforting blanket, Although at some point, it does it kind of stop being fantasy and start becoming kind of a different subgenre of itself. Or if you're trying to make a fantasy world, fire on all of its six cylinders and be a fantasy world, whether you need to keep in mind exactly what it is that fantasy is supposed to be fantasizing about. Now, obviously, in the broader terms of fiction and stuff, there's a lot of things that can be kind of swept in under fantasy, and it's not limited to classical era or medieval era time periods. But there's a line where it stops being fantasy and starts being speculative science fiction, or there's a line where it stops being a positive, a nostalgic experience, and instead becomes one of existential questioning and fear, which is what you get out of the horror genre. And so, yeah, just consider the genre itself and not just the setting or the game rules. I mean, they all have their place to create the larger experience of playing Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games. Anyway, I guess there's another video for this however many days of Krampus it is before I finally give up. And so hit like and subscribe. Check out Total Party Scales on Drive-Thru RPG. Have a Merry Krampus and stay waspinated.